After 70, I stopped proving myself to anyone. And I want to tell you today, that single shift changed absolutely everything about how I experience my remaining years. For most of my life, I lived as though I were constantly on trial. Every accomplishment needed a witness. Every decision needed approval. Every quiet Sunday afternoon carried a faint undercurrent of guilt, as though I should be doing something more, achieving something more, proving something more. I did not realize how heavy that invisible weight had become until, somewhere after my 70th birthday, I finally set it down. Welcome, my friends, to Eternal Flame Wisdom. Today I want to walk you through exactly how this shift happened in my own life, why it took 70 years to arrive, and how it might change your remaining years the way it changed mine. Let me start at the beginning, because understanding where this need to prove myself came from helps explain how deeply it had rooted itself into my identity. The first thing I had to understand was where the need to prove myself actually began. I grew up in a household where achievement was the primary language of love. Good grades earned warmth. Athletic success earned attention. Obedience earned approval. Nothing was ever cruel or overtly harsh, but the pattern was unmistakable. Love, in my childhood home, was something you earned through performance, not something simply given because you existed. I carried that pattern into adulthood without ever examining it. I built a career defined by constant achievement, promotions, recognition, longer hours than necessary, because somewhere inside me, a young boy still believed that resting meant becoming invisible, that slowing down meant losing love. I built a marriage, raised children, maintained a home, all while carrying this same quiet, exhausting question underneath every decision. Is this enough? Am I doing enough? Will they still respect me if I stop pushing? For decades, I did not even recognize this pattern as unusual. I assumed everyone lived this way. I assumed constant striving was simply what responsible adulthood required. The second thing I had to understand was the true cost of a lifetime spent proving myself. It took me until my late 60s to fully grasp what this pattern had cost me. Not in terms of career success, because by most external measures, I had succeeded. The cost was internal, quieter, and far more significant. I had rarely, in 50 years of adult life, simply enjoyed a moment without immediately measuring it against some standard of achievement. A vacation became something to optimize and document. A hobby became something to master and showcase. Even rest itself became a performance, something I felt compelled to justify by explaining how it would make me more productive afterward. I remember sitting at my youngest daughter's wedding, a moment that should have been pure, uncomplicated joy, and catching myself calculating whether I had contributed enough to the event, whether my toast had been impressive enough, whether the other guests perceived me as a successful and accomplished father of the bride. In the middle of one of the most beautiful days of my life, I was still performing. That memory haunted me for years afterward. How much of my life, I began to wonder, had I actually experienced, and how much had I simply performed for an invisible audience that, in truth, was barely watching at all? This leads to the third thing I discovered, which changed everything. The audience I had spent 70 years performing for had never actually been paying close attention. This realization arrived slowly, and somewhat painfully. I began to notice, in my 70s, that the people whose approval I had chased so relentlessly throughout my life could barely remember the specific achievements I had once believed were so crucial. Colleagues from my most demanding professional years could not recall the details of projects I had once sacrificed weekends and family time to complete. Even close family members, when I gently asked, had only vague impressions of accomplishments I had once considered defining moments of my life. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it with a strange, liberating clarity. Nearly everyone, it turns out, is far too consumed with their own life, their own worries, their own quiet performances, to spend much time evaluating mine. The audience I had spent decades performing for had largely been a construction of my own mind, not an actual attentive tribunal watching and grading my every move. Once I truly understood this, something inside me finally exhaled. The fourth thing that changed everything was learning the difference between contribution and performance. I want to be careful here, because I am not suggesting that effort, excellence, or genuine contribution no longer matter after 70. They absolutely do. The shift I experienced was not a retreat from caring about doing good work or being a good person. The shift was releasing the compulsive need for that work to be witnessed, validated, and applauded by others. Now, when I help a neighbor repair something around their house, I do it because it genuinely brings me satisfaction, not because I am quietly hoping they will mention my helpfulness to others. When I spend an afternoon teaching my grandson how to fish, I do it purely for the joy of his company, not because I am building a mental case for what a devoted grandfather I am. The actions themselves remained largely the same. What changed entirely was the internal motivation behind them. This distinction, between contributing because it is genuinely meaningful and performing because I need validation, has become one of the most important lessons of my later years. Contribution, done quietly, without needing witnesses, feels entirely different in the body. It feels lighter. It feels more honest. It feels, finally, like something done purely out of love rather than a subtle transaction for approval. The fifth thing that shifted was my relationship with rest itself. For most of my adult life, rest felt like something that needed to be earned, and even then, justified afterward through renewed productivity. After 70, I finally allowed myself to rest simply because I was tired, or simply because I wanted to, without needing to prove that the rest would make me more useful later. I remember the first time I spent an entire Tuesday afternoon sitting on my porch, doing absolutely nothing productive, no book, no project, simply watching the neighborhood go about its business, and feeling not a single ounce of guilt about it. That afternoon remains, strangely, one of the more significant milestones of my later life. It represented a complete internal permission I had never fully granted myself before. I no longer need to justify my rest to anyone, including myself. I no longer need to explain why I chose not to attend a particular event, why I decided to spend a day quietly at home instead of socializing, why I said no to a request that once, at a younger age, I would have said yes to purely out of obligation. The sixth thing that changed, and perhaps the most surprising, was how much more genuinely connected I became to the people around me once I stopped performing for them. You might assume that releasing the need for approval would make someone more isolated, more withdrawn from relationships. I discovered the opposite. Once I stopped performing for my children, my old colleagues, my extended family, our interactions became far more honest and far more enjoyable for everyone involved. My children, I believe, sense the difference immediately. Conversations with them are no longer subtly shaped by my need for them to be impressed with me. I can simply be present, curious about their lives, genuinely engaged, without the exhausting undercurrent of needing to demonstrate my continued relevance or worth. They, in turn, seem more relaxed around me as well, freed from whatever unconscious pressure my old need for approval had placed on our relationship. I believe this happens because performance, even well-intentioned performance, creates a subtle emotional distance between people. When you stop performing and simply show up as yourself, flaws and quiet moments included, real intimacy finally has room to grow. I want to speak directly now to those of you watching this who are still caught in the pattern I lived inside for 70 years. Perhaps you still feel the need to justify your choices to your adult children. Perhaps you still feel a quiet compulsion to demonstrate your continued usefulness, your continued sharpness, your continued relevance to a world that, in truth, is not scrutinizing you nearly as closely as you imagine. I want to tell you today, with the full weight of everything I have learned, you are allowed to stop. You do not need one more accomplishment to justify your existence. You do not need one more accolade to prove your worth. You have already, simply by living this long, by loving the people you have loved, by doing the work you have done, earned the right to simply exist now without constant justification. This shift did not happen for me overnight, and it will likely not happen for you overnight either. It happened slowly, through small moments of choosing presence over performance, rest over justification, authenticity over approval. But I promise you, once it begins, it becomes easier and easier to continue. These days, my life looks smaller from the outside than it once did. Fewer accomplishments to list. Fewer achievements to announce. But from the inside, it feels immeasurably larger, because for the first time in 70 years, I am living it fully present, rather than watching myself live it, waiting to see how well I am performing. If you take nothing else from today's conversation, I hope you take this. You do not need to prove yourself to anyone anymore. Not to your children. Not to old colleagues. Not even to yourself. You have already lived a life worthy of respect simply by surviving its difficulties, learning its lessons, and loving the people who mattered along the way. That is enough. It was always enough. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today at Eternal Flame Wisdom. If this message reached something inside you, please share your own experience in the comments below. I would love to know what you have stopped proving, or what you are still working toward releasing. Take care of yourselves this week, my friends. Rest without guilt. Show up without performing. And trust, finally, that you have already proven enough. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. I will see you in the next conversation.